Most bankers aren't ready to help you until after their third cup of coffee. But with Central National Bank's after-hours service, you don't have to wait for the bank lobby to open to get help. You can contact us from 6 to 8:30 in the morning or from 5 to 10 in the evening, and we'll connect you to a real, live, local person who can answer questions and fix problems 7 days a week. Bank different. Bank Central. Central National Bank. Member FDIC.
Get ready for the greatest roast of all time, the Roast of Tom Brady, a Netflix live event happening May 5th. Hosted by Kevin Hart, the 7-time world champion gets his cleats held to the fire by famous friends and frenemies on an unforgettable night where everything is fair game. Tune in on May 5th at 5 p.m. Pacific time for the Roast of Tom Brady, live only on Netflix.
Support for this podcast comes from Frito-Lay and the 2023 Snack Bracket Championship. The Frito-Lay Snack Challenge is underway, and fans are voting on their favorite snacks to crown champion. We're talking about prime-time matchups between the best 64 snacks in the land. Will Ruffles Ridges reign supreme? Can Doritos defend their dynasty? Or will Smart Food use their smarts for a surprise upset? Only you can decide. Get in on all the action for a chance to win up to $1,000 or a year's worth of snacks. Let your snacks be heard. Just go to fritolaysnacket.sbnation.com to vote and enter for a chance to win. No purchase necessary. Sweepstakes ends April 3rd, 2023. Void where prohibited. Year's worth of snacks awarded in the form of 52 coupons, each good for 1 bag of chips. See official rules at fritolaysnacket.sbnation.com.
Welcome to the Women's Hoops and Talks podcast, the What Podcast, where we are elevating the voice of women in basketball. We are part of the Almighty Baller Radio Network, and you can find the Women's Hoops and Talks podcast as part of the Blazers Edge podcast feed. I'm Tara, and with me, as always, is my co-host Kendall. And today we have a guest who's going to join us for our entire episode. I'm really happy to welcome Caitlin Cooper. She is a writer for Indy Cornrows, which is the Indiana Pacers blog at SB Nation. So much to talk about with the playoffs coming that we thought we would just invite Caitlin on to speak with us for the whole time, and we're looking forward to hearing more about what's going on in the East. So welcome to the show, Caitlin.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
And it's also great to talk to you again, Kendall.
Nice to talk to you too.
So let's go ahead and learn a little bit about our guest first. Caitlin, how did you become involved in basketball? Like, what's your background with sports? Is it something did you play, or have you just always been interested in it? What brought you to where you are today?
Right. So, I mean, I played, but I think what really connected me to the game is I made this comparison before, but if people have watched the movie Remember the Titans, I was a lot like Hayden Panettiere's character in that movie. My dad coached high school boys basketball in Indiana for over 12 years, and that whole time I would go along for scouting trips. I took stats. I ran the clock at summer league games. I helped with playbooks. I'd go into open gyms. So I really just couldn't get enough of learning about how coaches strategize for games. Like if there was a hospitality room at a sectional tournament or something, I wanted to sneak in there, not for the food, but to hear about, how are they planning to guard, IU's next top recruit or whatever it may be. So that's really what got me involved in the game. And I think that if people read my work at Indy Cornrows, hopefully they'll kind of see that I'm passionate about sharing what little I've come to know about the game in that way and learning about it kind of in basketball's heartland here in Indiana. So.
Wow, I had no idea that you grew up, the daughter of a coach, so involved. It makes perfect sense, though, because like you said, I've read your writing, and it's very detailed, and it's very analytical, and it really focuses on different strategies that teams try to employ to either slow each other down or, get the jump on the other team. That makes perfect sense now. But you said you did play basketball as well. What was your position?
Right. So I mainly played forward. When I was growing up, I was a little bit taller than some of the people in my age in junior high, so I would play inside. And then once I got in high school, my coaches kind of saw what I could do dribbling, so I kind of was more on the perimeter. So when I was on varsity and JV, So
did you have a signature move?
A signature move. Well, I liked being able to, if I had like a bigger person guarding me in the post, I kind of liked I would work on post moves a lot. So I kind of liked going with up and under moves and just, seeing if I could beat a bigger person to the basket or fake them out, or that type of stuff was always fun to me. So.
Did you play recreationally? Did you play at a higher level? Did you have aspirations to play in college, or did you play in college?
No, never in college. I would say in my area, I was probably fairly average. So,
what are some of the things that you learned about sports and kind of about the world growing up in a family that was so obviously connected to basketball?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that part of that was it was a little bit of a blessing because I was brought up in that and I was kind of inducted into, a bit of a boys club when it came to sports, just simply because I was the coach's daughter, that people would kind of listen and be like, oh, she knows sports. But the flip side of that was also that I remember one summer I was running clock at a summer league game, and there was a rival coach who didn't know who I was, and it was kind of a hands-on deck thing, and he was refereeing a game, and our team went to roll the ball in the court, and he was kind of demonstrative with me, like, okay, wait. Like, I wouldn't know that you shouldn't start the clock before the person touched the ball. And, at the time I just thought, that's kind of funny. And then, later on in the day, there was two players' younger brothers running the clock who were much younger than me, and he didn't have that same response to them. So it kind of was an eye-opening moment of like, do people think that I know sports, or is my authority my own, or did they only just think that I knew sports because my dad's the coach? So, there's kind of that balancing dynamic where it was really a blessing, and I wouldn't ever say it was a curse because my dad always fostered all of my opinions and was very much the type of man that would welcome a daughter's opinion equal to that as a son's. But it was kind of an eye-opening point to what, how the world perceives women's voices in sports.
Sure. So you must have, growing up in Indiana, you must have grown up a Pacers fan. Is that a safe assumption?
Yes. And, here in Indiana, a lot of, I think people assume because it's a basketball state that it's mostly that there would be so many Pacer fans, but I think that it's kind of more of a college basketball state. So it's a little bit more unique to find, or at least in my area, it was unique to find people that were really hardcore Pacer or NBA fans. So, but yes, I was always a Pacer fan.
So kind of jumping into kind of more recent stuff going on in the NBA, being a Pacers fan, what do you kind of think of what's been happening with the Pacers, especially in the last 2 years and especially this season with all the changes that have happened?
Oh, it's been a revelation for me. Like I've said this a couple times, but I've had to eat so much crow. Just you wouldn't have expected this amount of a turnaround after what all happened last summer. And, a lot of that, I think you have to credit to the amount of a gigantic leap that Victor Oladipo took over the summer and just came back and really embraced the city. And the contrast of that with the way that Paul George left, I just wouldn't have seen it coming. Obviously I didn't. People know what my preseason takes were, so I don't need to rehash them.
So being a Blazers podcast, we tend to talk about the Western Conference a little more, but obviously the Eastern Conference has been having a lot of stuff going on. They are always kind of considered the lesser of the two, the weaker conference. What is it kind of like being a fan of a team in the Eastern Conference and hearing all of those things?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I definitely think that the Western Conference is obviously the more top-heavy, probably loaded one of the two, but I think the East is going to be so fascinating simply because, I mean, I think if the Warriors are healthy, many people probably assume that we're going to see the Rockets and the Warriors in the Western Conference Finals. And in the East, I just think that there's so many unknowns, like from seed 1 through 8. Like if you look at Boston, you have to question, like, how healthy will they be? Is this their top gear? And with Cleveland, they've only played 2 games with Kevin Love and Larry Nance and Rodney Hood in the lineup. And Philly's young, and they have this turnover rate issue. Washington hasn't had John Wall this time. Can they be the best team that he's played with when he's back, or will they just kind of keep playing to the level of their opponent? And, Toronto, when you look at them, can they play their bench in the playoffs? And will Lowry and DeRozan kind of shake off their bugaboos they've had in the playoffs the last several years? And with the Pacers, I have some questions about how teams are defending Oladipo and the space and how they're hedging on him. And, the Heat's kind of had this offensive surge, and Milwaukee's just kind of a weird team to me. So I think because all those teams have so many questions, I think that the Eastern Conference playoffs, while there might not be the same level of the top two teams, will quite possibly be more interesting just because we don't know what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. So you touched on kind of the injuries in the Eastern Conference, and injuries have kept so many players out of both conferences this year. But specifically, one team that has dealt with a lot has been the 76ers, and Markel Fultz just got announced earlier today that he was coming back tonight, and the game is actually going on right now, and he's playing in it. So what do you think having a team like the 76ers is already kind of shaking up the Eastern Conference in a way that people didn't really expect. So what do you think kind of having him having him now in the lineup, that first round or that first draft pick, what do you think that's going to do for that team and kind of possibly in the playoffs?
Right. You really hit the nail on the head there. They really are kind of shaking it up because their starting lineup has the best net rating of any starting lineup in the NBA, minimum 500 minutes, and their defense has just been really solid. I think they're top 5 in offense and defense since the start of the month. So as far as Fultz goes, really they don't have a lot of playmakers. That's kind of just Ben Simmons, and he has so much responsibility on his shoulders to create shots for other people. I mean, Embiid can get his once he has the ball, but Simmons has to set the table for pretty much everybody else. So if they can get Fultz back and he can be, semi-confident, even if his shot isn't necessarily there, just having another person off the bench who can create shots for other people at a high clip, I think can be a difference maker for them.
So do you think that they're potentially going to be a threat to the Cavs if they do end up playing them first round? I know a lot of people are saying that they could potentially be that upset and get the Cavs in the first round. Do you kind of buy into that?
Well, my prediction on how that seeding would shake up is, Philly's either going to get a 3 or a 4 seed, and I kind of think Cleveland's going to hang out there just because the Pacers have the tougher schedule and Cleveland's kind of hitting their stride offensively. So I don't know if they'll see each other in the first round, but I definitely think that's going to be an interesting series. I like how they match up and just Philly's overall defense. I think it's a lot's going to come down to how much will the lack of experience of Embiid and Simmons in that type of a stage matter against, obviously how battle-tested LeBron is. But I don't know that I would pick them to win it, but I think it would definitely be an interesting series.
Mm-hmm. Are there any series that you're really looking forward to in the East or even in the West, but probably more specifically the East?
I think I would there's 2 maybe. Because if the Pacers, I don't think the Pacers are going to get into 3 or 4. Like, I guess maybe I shouldn't say this. The one thing I know about the Pacers is that sometimes I don't know much about the Pacers. So they might surprise me on this West Coast road trip, and they have the toughest remaining schedule. They edge in there, but I would be surprised by that. So I kind of like to see what they would do if they play the Sixers. If I have to pick between the Cavs and the Sixers, I'd rather they played the Sixers just because they have the highest turnover rate in the NBA, and the Pacers are so good in the open floor. They score the most points off turnovers per 100. They're great off fast breaks, and they played each other in the tiebreaker game that the Pacers took, and they shot Oladipo and Bogdanovich were like a combined 5 of 32, and they shot like 5 of 24 from 3. And despite all of this, Sabonis got injured. Al Jefferson had to play crunch minutes, and they still won just because Philly just doesn't take very good care of the ball. So I think that could be an interesting matchup just from like a nerdy standpoint, but also like the narrative standpoint. Everybody would turn it into like this referendum on whether you should tank or not, and that would give us more stuff to write about. So, and then I kind of like to watch the Wizards because I kind of wonder, they're struggling a little bit here, and if John Wall doesn't come back right away, like, will they want to fall to 7th? Like, I kind of wonder if they'll want to drop down to 7th and play Boston in the first round just because Boston has so much injury history, and that rematch, I kind of like the dynamic between those two teams. So those are 2 series I would be interested in.
What about the Western Conference? Is there anything in there? I don't know how much Western Conference you really care about, but
I definitely do. I have a question for you guys. I talked to Tara about this a little bit before we started, but like, how happy are you with where Portland's seated right now, getting to play San Antonio in the first round if the playoffs started today? Like, is that a matchup you guys are pretty excited about?
I have such a hard time when we don't know what's going to happen. It's much easier for me to have an opinion once the matchup actually happens. So I defer that one to you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have kind of two answers to that. I think it depends on Kawhi. I think if he's back, that matchup scares me a little bit, just because I think if Kawhi does come back, he's not going to come back until he's 100%. So if he does end up playing, that means that he's going to come back and can take over the game at any minute. And I think he'd be kind of playing with a chip on his shoulder too, especially with all kind of the drama that's been surrounding the Spurs right now with him and everything. So I think that with him in the lineup, I'm not a huge fan of that series, but with him out of the lineup, I'm totally okay with it. I don't have too many worries about it.
And it would also be another one with a good storyline, because it would be the Blazers against LaMarcus. And the thing about LaMarcus that I admired about him when he was in Portland, and I am admiring about him again right now in his situation in San Antonio, is that he was never supposed to be the number one guy, but everybody around him keeps getting injured and he keeps getting left as the guy holding the bag, you know? And so that's kind of happening to him in San Antonio right now. He's kind of like the healthiest and the strongest one left standing to lead whatever's left of the team. So I think it would be an interesting narrative. And again, it would give us lots and lots of things to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that.
Do you guys worry about, like, I know right now Aminu and Harkless and Turner shoot, like, that's kind of been how their offense has surged, that they're shooting really well on those catch and shoot threes of late. Like, do you worry that their shooting will regress when the playoffs start, or do you think that they've turned a corner?
I don't know. I think that it could go either way, because we've seen those players step up in the playoffs, and we've also seen them kind of drop out in the playoffs. So we've seen both sides of that. So I think it's kind of hard to say what I think will happen as far as like how they're going to do. But I think that they're playing more consistently right now. So I think that that's a good sign. So it leads me to believe more that they're probably going to step up in the playoffs. But I mean, I think that's kind of the thing with Portland, is that sometimes they can be very inconsistent, especially that bench. So it's kind of hard to say, but definitely, we're definitely hoping that they step it up and continue to play the way that they are.
What's a successful season for the Blazers? Like, is it successful if they win the first round, or is it successful if they push Houston or Golden State in the second round? Or like, what are your expectations? What would you say is a successful end of the season? Because this, to me, the Portland's just fascinating. Like, what they've done in the Western Conference is just is very interesting to me.
It's very surprising, I would say. I really did not expect to find the Blazers in the 3 seed, and I feel like a bad fan for not having expected that. But I've talked about this on the other podcast that I was expecting the other Western Conference teams to be much stronger, and I just thought the whole competition in general was going to be really super tough, and I wasn't anticipating all these injuries. But for me, I think that Portland really needs to. For sure, they need to win a round in the playoffs. And then, depending on who they face off against, I think that will determine whether it was a really good season or if it was just like, that was a successful season. But I think when you were asking about the other players, whether or not they could continue with their hot shooting that they've been mostly in at least the second half of the shooting, I think one of the things that's different about this year that from other years is that in years past, if the offense couldn't hit shots, Portland had nothing to fall back on. That was it. They were done. They were toast. And we've seen a lot of really low scoring games this year. We've seen that they can turn on the defense and keep their head above water in the way that they never could before. So that's kind of the biggest difference I see about how the Portland team might perform in the playoffs. But I have a question for you about, you said that the Portland is kind of fascinating to you, and I've definitely found Indiana fascinating, and I know Kendall loves Oladipo. So we've sort of both had our eye on Indiana. And lo and behold, there's been a lot of talk lately about Nate McMillan in the Coach of the Year conversation, as well as Coach Stotts. So what are your thoughts on whether or not one of those two coaches have a chance at being named Coach of the Year, or should they be in the conversation?
Yeah, so first let me preface this by saying that I have no idea what Coach of the Year is actually awarding. Like, if it's best coach, then it's going to go to Popovich every year. If it's coach of the best team, then it's going to D'Antoni. And, Casey and Stotts have kind of both made more of the same of, like, what they had. And then you have Brad Stevens, who's making most out of his current players. He always gets the most out of them, and they're winning against all this adversity. And then you have Nate McMillan, who's kind of exceeding expectations. So, but back to your question, like, if I just have to pick between Stotts and McMillan, like earlier, some of the stuff you said about Terry Stotts, I think, is kind of what we always like about Greg Popovich, or to me, why he's the GOAT, is sort of that he can reinvent a team. Like, they went from having two traditional bigs that were focused on defense to 2014 being a team that's totally focused on ball movement and player movement and just super high efficiency. And like this year with Portland, what you just said is so true. Like, he's getting Dame and McCollum to buy in on defense, and not necessarily that they're stoppers, but they're respectable enough that they can be a top 8 defensive team. And, that goes back to your coach, getting them to believe that, hey, this is something important that you need to do. And like some of the internal development, I think you're kind of seeing with Harkless, that he's finally starting to look like that 3-and-D threat that I think that you guys were hoping to get. And, with Connaughton and Napier, like, they're giving solid contributions off the bench. So, like, a lot of that's there. And then on the other hand, with McMillan, my only questions there would be, like, you have to give him, again, a lot of credit that he's got this team that really plays for and with each other, and that, he built this mousetrap for Oladipo. But then you kind of have this question of, I think that Oladipo kind of supplies the cheese, though, in that regard, because, like, they're 0-6 without him. And his impact numbers are just insane. Like, if you look at his defensive numbers, I looked at this a couple days ago, and like when he isn't on the floor, they're equivalent of like a dead last defense. And when he's on the floor, they're like a top 10 defense. So just everything that they do. But what I would say about Nate is, like, at this time last year, he was still holding so strong to like his defensive ethos about we must guard our position. So they would play the Raptors, and he would have Monte Ellis out there being forced to guard DeMar DeRozan instead of like hiding him on DeMar Carroll. And this year, he's like let all of that go. Like, and that's a big thing for Oladipo, because like even against the Sixers, they let Bojan Bogdanovic guard Ben Simmons so that Oladipo could kind of hang out on Robert Covington, which that's not a slight at Robert Covington. It's just that he's not going to be creating plays. Like, you're not going to be as active because he's more of catch and shoot. So, like, just that development alone. But then I don't know that I could pick Nate for Coach of the Year in this regard. Like, because of those things I said, he would definitely be like a most improved coach. But then there's just these little teensy things. Like, here lately, teams are really crowding Oladipo and showing on pick and rolls with him, and they really haven't made very many adjustments, which really makes me weary for the postseason. So if I'm just picking between Stotts and McMillan, I would have to go with Stotts.
Kendall, what do you think?
I think it's fair to talk about them in the conversation, but I think it's going to either be Brad Stevens or Dwayne Casey. And I think that they're just kind of what they're doing this season. I think it's hard to kind of match that. Obviously, I think that there's so many other coaches you can talk about that are doing great things that have kind of turned their teams around. But I think it's kind of hard to compete with Stevens and Casey this season.
Right. I think Casey's going to take it. Just in this comparison between these two, like, they're pretty evenly matched, actually.
Yeah, I think Casey will probably get it, partly also because he's just sort of out ahead of the narrative. And you're right, Caitlin, and this is something that drives me crazy about like all awards given to anybody in the NBA for anything except for the highest scoring award, because that's the only one that has any sort of rubric at all around it. But we don't really know what they're voting for. I wish there was an award for, like, over a series of years, the most patient coach, because I think hands down Terry Stotts would get the most patience, because he's waited, and he's gently moved this internal development along, and the team stuck with him long enough so that he could see this internal development through, which is something that not a lot of teams have the patience enough to do as well. Not just the coach's patience, but the team's patience. So I don't know. I think I think that is something that could be rewarded, but because you don't see, like, you see such incremental change that no one's ever going to award him for something that just came up so slowly and suddenly, oh, here we are. We know what we're doing. And I think, Casey's had so much great coverage, and he deserves the coverage where, they said we're going to reset the culture. Oh, and we're not changing anybody. So that's really impressive.
Right. They've just, they've remade their entire playing style from going away from isolation to moving the ball to taking more threes. I think he'll definitely win.
Yeah. And men in their 20s are hard to convince to do something differently. I mean, he has a whole team. If you think about all the guys that in their 20s and trying to talk them into doing anything, much less getting a whole team full of them to try to change their, all change directions and go in one direction at the same time. That's kind of a miracle that he's managed to pull that off. Well, as we move into the playoffs, I'm wondering, Caitlin, what types of things do you watch for, through your coach's daughter's eyes or through your analyst's eyes? What do you watch for as teams take each other on in these extended series that you can't watch for when they just play each other once here and once there?
Right. I think you nailed it there. My favorite thing about the playoffs is game 2, because I like to see, what response they're going to have to what happened in the first game. If let's pretend that the Pacers play the Cavs, which I'm hoping doesn't happen because I don't really want to watch that again, if I'm being honest. But let's say that they do. If LeBron ends up placed on Thad, and Thad, he's made threes this year, but not enough. He's not so much of a threat that you would think, oh, LeBron's not going to roam off of him or hedge off of him. And if they do that and they're really hedging on Oladipo in the series and they win game 1, what's Nate McMillan going to come back and do in game 2? How is he going to use Thad to find seams in the offense to make it, to punish LeBron for either, coming out high or, whatever else they're going to do? Are they going to have more weak side action for Bogdanovich and Darren Collison to prevent good one pass away defense? So I like game 2. We'll just put it at that. The adjustments of after what opponents and coaches are going to do to respond to what happened in game 1.
What do you think, Kendall? What do you like about playoff basketball?
I like that. Well, I think one of my problems with the regular season is that some of the top team, and I've talked about this before, where sometimes the teams like Golden State and the Cavs, sometimes it seems like they're just not, they don't care as much. Mm-hmm. It's like they're saving their energy for the playoffs. So what I like about the playoffs is that everyone is giving it their all. So you're not getting that, we're kind of this game doesn't really matter, so we're not going to try that hard. It's every game matters. I mean, in the regular season, every game should matter too, but to teams like that, they just don't. So in the playoffs, it's just a heightened level of playing, and it's a lot more enjoyable in that sense, where it's their last chance basically, and they're playing every game. There's a lot on the line for every game. So I like watching it for that reason.
I really enjoy gamesmanship, when coaches are not just coaching their team out on the floor, but looking at long-term strategies, which may or may not include, during the year, seeding certain players or not showing other teams some of your strongest moves on purpose. I love the gamesmanship that's involved, especially when you come to the playoffs. But that's what's going on in my head. Does that really happen? What are some of the more obvious gamesmanship moves that y'all can think of that you've seen coaches do before? Or is that just something you think I'm making up in my head? Because I do that a lot.
No, I think that happens. I think especially with teams like Golden State and Cleveland, where it seems, in prior years, it's almost inevitable that that's going to be a rematch, that, maybe in those matchups they won't play Kevin Love at 5 very much, if at all, because they don't want Golden State to have the opportunity to test what's going to work on that. Or, maybe they won't put LeBron on Draymond because they don't want Golden State to see how they're going to use him to roam. Like those aren't examples that actually happened last year but necessarily just as examples of what coaches will do when they are definitely thinking that, hey, we're on a collision course to face that team.
Yeah, when you were talking before, I was wondering about when you said your favorite thing is game 2, which I loved how you said that. But do coaches change their strategy as soon as game 2? Do they kind of play out the first couple of games and then see what's going to happen? Or do you think they are constantly, every game, they are rearranging things?
Well, I think like a good example would be, I guess I would say yes and no, because 2 seasons ago, the Hornets and the Heat played each other, and the Heat were just, if I recall, were just absolutely on fire. And I think Steve Clifford said, like, we're not going to overreact to that. We can't change our strategy because, they shot lights out, which I think is accurate. And I don't remember what ended up happening in the very next game after that. But, I think you have to be realistic. Like, let's pretend Evan Turner comes out in one of you guys' games and shoots, 80% from 3 and goes 4 or 5 from 3. Like, as a coach, you're not going to overreact and be like, oh, we're going to change our coverage to that. But if, like I said, if the Cavs come out and they're really using LeBron as a roamer, then you might have to alter little things that you do offensively, make little tweaks about where you're setting a screen or what you're doing on the weak side to make sure that he's going to be involved in the action so that he can't do that so easily. I think on a micro level, you'll see little tweaks as soon as game 2. On a macro level, they're not going to wildly overreact to something that, might regress back to the norm in game 2 or game 3.
Well, from your mouth to God's ears for Evan Turner shooting 80% from 3. Boy, that would sort of just
I know the Pacers would have liked him to do that. Well, actually, he didn't shoot the 3 that bad when he was here. He barely took any, but he didn't shoot it that poorly, so I shouldn't poke at him on that specific count.
Yeah, he was there for such a short time. We've talked about this before. There's a lot of connections between Portland, Indiana, with the McMillan connection and the Sabonis. We haven't asked about Sabonis. How is he doing?
Oh, well, he's been out with an ankle injury since they played the Sixers, and he was cleared to return to play against the Heat yesterday at 5, and then when he came out for warm-ups, he tweaked it again, so he's back out, which kind of hurts the Pacers because they just got Darren Collison back, so that gave them reoriented what they were doing off the bench when Darren went back in the starting lineup, and then they're having to play Al Jefferson extended minutes and Trevor Booker minutes at 5, and you definitely, they're going to need Sabonis in the playoffs, and they're going to need him healthy. So I don't know.
Does he look at all like his dad to you? Like when he plays? Or does he just have a completely different style?
You'll see little things, just the way he impacts the game. I'm not going to say that he's the passer that his dad was, but he definitely has a great feel, and he's polished with what passes he does make. Like, just a quick example, like he and Oladipo are so good in dribble handoff action, and sometimes teams will start to overplay that because Victor's just been so lethal coming downhill off of that Sabonis will fake it and do a quick backdoor pass to Victor cutting for a dunk. And you'll just see he can make.
But that looks awesome.
Yeah. He'll just make a quick pass, and sometimes there'll be no look. And that's one of my favorite little nerdy things that the Pacers run. And I get really excited when it's the backdoor dunk off the dribble handoff when teams overplay it. So you'll see little things like that where I think you can see his dad, but I won't say that he's, to that level yet, at least.
Well, that answer reminds me of the kind of the last sort of general area of questions that we have for you. Kendall, any more questions about the NBA situation right now before we move on to the last few questions?
No, I think we touched most things.
Okay. Well, your description of Sabonis and the handoff and what was going on, that it got me thinking. You write really descriptively about what's going on the court. And that's one of the things I really admire about your writing. And as someone who's really just been learning more about the game for the last 4 or 5 years or so for my own personal, that's how long it's been since I've really been trying to dig into the game and understand it and really be able to talk about it. You seem to have kind of a natural ability to see what's going on in the play. And so I was just going to kind of ask you some advice for how do you approach a game when you're trying to think about, okay, what is this team going to provide as a challenge to the Pacers, or what is this team that I'm watching now really good at, and how would I expect the Pacers are going to counteract that? What are some of the ways that you approach how you're looking at how you're preparing yourself when you're writing about games that are coming up and things like that?
Right. So I would say, like, here are my most recent piece. Like, if people head over to my Twitter account, they'll see it pinned, just so if they want to read what I'm actually talking about. I'm not necessarily trying to do a shameless plug. I'm just
you can do as many shameless plugs as you want. That's what the whole purpose of the podcast is to elevate the voice of women who are doing amazing things in basketball. Everybody go check out Caitlin's stuff. Okay, now go ahead.
Okay, so I've talked about it a couple times so far. Like, here late in the season, Oladipo's speed and his skilled agility is kind of the way that he just buzzes right around bigs when they drop in the paint, or when guards duck under on screens, and he just has no problem getting to the rim. Like, that's partially what made him an all-star. But now, because he's been so good at that, when they run pick and roll actions, the defender guarding the screener is kind of stepping out and either hedging or full on out hard showing more here towards the second half of the season than they were at the beginning of the season. And so early on in the year, when they were playing the Pistons, anytime Thaddeus Young was the screener, Tobias Harris was showing on all of those. And the Pacers had issues playing with the Pistons other than the one game they came back from 20 points down. Like, it just really wasn't a good matchup, and for other reasons beyond this. But I remember I used my notes section on my iPhone a lot, and I just started jotting down, like, every time they were showing on that and thinking, hey, I think if people watch these games late in the season, more and more teams are going to do this, because Oladipo is really he'll turn it over, or sometimes when he tries to get a head full of steam, he gets really aerodynamic, almost like a jockey would when they're trying to prevent wind resistance, and he doesn't necessarily see the floor always so well to make like those left-handed pocket passes. So as early as they played all 4 games against Detroit before like even the first or second week of January. And so I just started taking notes on all that, and I'll just record of every time that those types of things happen. And now here it's happened where Boston and Washington late in the year were doing that more. So then I'll go on to like NBA.com, pull up the league pass, and go to those sections where I bookmark those plays and just watch like, okay, what was happening here? And sometimes I'll pause it and just run my cursor slow so the video will go slow and see, like, is this because Oladipo had his head down? Is it because of where Miles Turner, did he set the screen too high and then have nowhere to go with the ball when he's in that playmaking situation? Or is this because Thad just wasn't hitting shots that it made it more of an incentive for Tobias to show on Oladipo? What exactly was going on? So in a long-term view, that's what I'll do. In a short term, like, they played the Bulls, and the Bulls tied a franchise record and made 3-pointers. And Mirotic launched 16 in a game, and I was just like, wow, how did one player get off that many threes against the Pacers? So the next day I clicked it and watched all of his shot attempts and noticed, hey, they're running this set where Mirotic and Markkanen are both high ball screens, setting high ball screens in like a horn set action. And Markkanen would pop and Mirotic would cut, and because Sabonis was hedging on those, it was just too hard of a recovery for him to get back to Markkanen. And on one occasion they did switch it and they gave up size, and Mirotic was able to shoot it over Corey Joseph, but because it was at least contested, they missed. So the next time they played the Bulls, I pulled up and kind of riffed off that and was like, hey, this is what the Pacers need to do. They haven't been very good at shooting threes, and here's how they were successful covering it, and here's how they weren't. So, that's kind of my process, is just to bookmark. If I see something little on a minute, little bit of a minutia level, that I'll mark it and then kind of store those up until the next time they play that opponent, or until that's, here in the playoffs with Oladipo, until we know that that's going to be a big hot button issue when they get into the first round, if that makes sense. If my method to my madness makes sense.
So it sounds like you're watching for patterns, and then when you see enough of what you think is a pattern, then you start writing it down whenever it happens. And I imagine, and I'm guessing what you mean by that is like at what point in the game it happens, so that you can then go watch it later, and then you can look at more of like what was happening around this particular action. So you could try to make some guesses on why it was happening over and over again.
Right, exactly.
Kind of sum it up?
Exactly, yeah.
Do you have any favorite resources that you use? You mentioned, that you would go and you would pull it up. Like, what do you use? Do you use Stats, NBA.com, Basketball Reference? What are some of your favorite go-to sites for helping you do research?
Well, there's a site called 3Ball that generates videos for like bloggers in case you want to embed them, that like you can go there and hit in the player's name, and then you can hit like made threes, and then you can watch all of Victor's made threes pretty quickly. Like they don't always have it updated like right the day after. Sometimes you have to wait a while, but that's pretty useful.
What's that called again?
3Ball. It's like
3Ball. Okay.
3ballimo.com. 3ballio.com. And then if you go over to NBA.com and you just hit like the box scores, if it's something simple like me wanting to watch Mirotic's threes, you just go to the box score and click the link, and then they'll pull up all those videos and you can watch them. Like, and then just like learning more about the game, I really like a Twitter account that's B-Ball Immersion. I love Basketball Dictionary. Just a lot of these film room guys, the more you follow them, they retweet other people's film room stuff. So you'll learn a lot about set actions if you're not somebody that's really grown up around the game your whole life. I think those are really good accounts where you can just learn more about how teams are creating misdirection or what they're doing on the off ball. Like I know Dylan Murphy, who runs the Basketball Dictionary, where they'll describe different like pick and roll coverages. He gave this tip on another podcast I was listening to where he said, don't watch the ball. Like if you want to learn more about the game, watch what the other players are doing. And I think that's really good advice, just to see, like, in the Pacers case, how is Bojan Bogdanovic reading a curl screen? Like, is he going around the curler? Is he doing a quick backdoor? Like, just what the Pacers are getting off of those types of actions that generates open shots for them.
Those are great resources, and some of them I haven't heard of before. So we will definitely look those up and write them down and link to them in the listen them into the notes for the show. Kendall, do you want to ask the last question?
Yeah, so we always like to end our interviews on this podcast kind of asking what women in sports inspires you. So, like, are there any, it can be someone that you've dealt with in your personal life. It can just be someone in the industry that you, that really inspires you, that you look up to. But is there any women in particular that really stand out to you?
Right. I think definitely two. Whitney Medworth here at SB Nation. She's the assistant editor. Like, it's always a pleasure. I've gotten to work with her a couple times because she's also a Pacer fan. So we've gone on the Limited Upside podcast that's hosted by Mike Prada and Ben Epstein a few times. And just, I think, like, her writing style is so uniquely hers. She writes those B-side columns, and it's like impossible not to love whatever she loves about the NBA. Like, just, and so I'm very envious that she has that sort of a unique writing voice, and that I'm also cognizant of the fact that, you guys here are trying to elevate the voices of women on an NBA podcast, but there's not a lot of female voices or that get asked to be guests on other podcasts. So the fact that Mike and Ben have had two on a few times whenever we've gotten to go on there, I that's special to me. And then also Haley O'Shaughnessy at The Ringer. Everyone should definitely follow her. She's like basically life goals for me. She's so thoughtful and smart with her writing, and she's extremely versatile too. Like, she was one of the few people that totally nailed that the Pacers could unlock Victor Oladipo when nobody else thought that they would. And then recently she wrote a feature on the inside world of NBA barbers that, like, you don't know that you need until you read it. So both of them are great follows if people are looking for more NBA content. Whitney's Twitter's at It's Whitney, and Haley O'Shaughnessy, I think, is Haley O something. But if you head over to The Ringer, you'll always find her work. So
now, talking about social media, how can people find you and your work?
Right. My handle is at C2_Cooper, and then it's Caitlin Cooper. And then all my stuff is always at Indy Cornrows. If you head over there, I'm usually on there 2 or 3 times a week with either, something a little bit more analytical, or here down the stretch, I've been writing a lot of standings watch pieces because that's been so fluid in the Eastern Conference. So people can usually find those too.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and getting us caught up on a lot of the stuff that's going on in the East. We really appreciate you taking the time to come and talk with us. That's going to do it for this edition of Women's Hoops and Talks, the What Podcast. We are, again, hosted by Blazers Edge on the Almighty Baller Radio Network. If you like what you heard, please go find Blazers Edge Podcast on iTunes or Stitcher and subscribe and rate and review and do all that good stuff. If you just want to get notified when the What Podcast episodes dropped, you can follow us on Twitter at Hoops and Talks. Every time we post a new episode, we will put it out on that Twitter feed. I am on Twitter at TCBBiggs, and Kendall is at KendallBennett16. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks.
Today's episode is brought to you by Cars.com. With over 2 million vehicles and 50,000 more added every day, Cars.com will match you with the perfect car for you, your budget, your life, your style. And if you're ready to say goodbye to your current car, Cars.com will get you an instant offer to cash it in. Just start by entering your license plate and get matched with a local dealer who will write you the check. So whether you're looking to buy or sell, just go to Cars.com. It's magical.